What I'm going to talk about today, and this is now the moment I can share my window with the PowerPoint presentation. What I'm going to talk about today is art collections and digitization practices in the age of digital image circulation. So this is something that both emerges from my scholarly research over the last 10 years, but also, as Barbara has mentioned, thanks to my professional expertise in the field of archive curation, particularly in Germany, but also with several art institutions in Italy. I will speak generally about art museums and digitization of artwork images, and very often referring to modern and contemporary art, since that is my field of expertise, both scholarly as well as professionally. So in starting with, I would like to address the the crisis that we're just still living, and ask myself or ask ourselves whether this crisis really is or can be a game changer with regard to digitization practices and public dissemination practices for art museums. Every one of us has surely noticed how much museums have tried to keep up with the complete lockdown, and being forced from night to day to invent themselves very often in what kind of contents they could deliver digitally in order to still be able to do what they need to do their job, which is not just doing research and preserving cultural heritage, but also engaging with the public and spreading the knowledge and the possibility of artworks to be seen to a broader audience. In the second part, I will think of what really has happened over the last decade, since, in my opinion, COVID-19 crisis hasn't been a real game changer. Maybe it has been a wake-up call, a moment of awareness, in which many art institutions understood how important it is to have a plan, a well-structured plan for their digital presence, so that it isn't just one possible development of their institutional framework, but that it is and still will, and even more will be, kind of a new exhibition space that they need to cover. So not just the physical presence anymore, but also their digital presence. And truly, what I believe happened with the COVID-19 crisis is that, basically, it was a moment when it made clear who is leading the race in art institutions, particularly art museums, with regard to digitization and public practices, and who stands still at the starting block. We will talk about this also with other seminars and workshops. I'm thinking especially of Valeria Finocchi's on Thursday, if I'm correct, which will show us the experience of an Italian state museum. So, of course, museums have responded quite differently to that. In the third part, I will then argue about a specific Venetian study case, again related to contemporary art. Particularly, I would like to show you what three major Venetian art institutions, the Venice Biennale, the Peggy Guggenheim collection, and the Fondation Pinault, have done so far over the last 10 years, in order to see whether all these theoretical stances, which I will be talking of in the second part, have in some way been adopted, applied by art institutions or not, and if not, why. So surely during the lockdown period, you might have read many articles on online newspapers about what museums tried to invent, or how they tried to reinvent themselves in order to allow some sort of museum visit. And this, for instance, the picture you see, it comes from an article on the New York Times. Those three that if I'm correct, Barbara, the entire slideshow is available on our common drive. So there are also the links to these articles if anyone is interested. All three articles, New York Times, The Guardian, and the Art newspaper, came out in April, so at the height of the lockdown in Europe. And they were discussing what was happening in the art world, and especially in art museums. The picture comes from a museum in Hastings, United Kingdom, and appeared in the New York Times. You can't visit the museum, but your robot can. So this is the solution that the art museum in Hastings applied. So basically allowing people from remote to steer the vehicle, and thus to have the true experience, if we can say so, of a museum visit, of a walk through the museum. The other two paper articles basically argue whether the art world as it is, especially if you think of blockbuster shows or big art fairs like Kunst Basel, or art exhibitions like the Venice Biennale or Documenta, can still keep up with their normal routine, and if they will do so in the coming years, in the forthcoming years after the coronavirus crisis. Probably a lot of things will be different. They already are. For instance, the Venice Biennale had to cancel its architecture exhibition this year and postpone almost all its events to the coming year. So it definitely had an impact. Whether it will be a lasting impact, that is, sincerely, I doubt it. But indeed, in the short to medium term, there will be the need for art museums to respond to a much stronger urgency to find their way in the digital realm. So what I'm arguing is that actually what we could see over the last 3-4 months in the lockdown period is actually just brought awareness to many art world specialists, art world professionals, and museums professionals. It brought awareness to the fact that you need a digital development and that kind of public platform to engage with a worldwide audience. So, but anyway, over the last 10 or even 20 years, digitization practices were already on their way, although in many respects at an experimental level. But in the last 10 years, definitely, there has been slowly a paradigm shift that has involved many international museums, some more, some less. But I believe the last decade can be described as the decade of standard building. So while shortly after the year 2000, so the first decade of the 21st century was rather a quite experimental moment where technologies even weren't already that definitive, if you think of the slow emergency of social media. The last decade somehow was about finding an equilibrium and stabilizing some of the digital and digitization solutions that had been found. Beginning with this that you see, this is a painting by Egon Schiele, Mutter und Kind of 1912, because this is, of course, a painting, but as you see now through your computer over the internet, it is the reproduction of a painting. But at the same time, the same painting is in itself, ontologically, the same artwork when it is present on a catalog or an exhibition catalog. In fact, this very painting was included in a very important art exhibition at the Solomon Guggenheim Museum in New York, 1965, Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele, which was kind of the breakthrough show of these two great Austrian masters in the United States of America. Of course, posthumous. And so you can see that already, I mean, with art catalogs, we all know it, there was a level of reproduction that basically spilled over to all the needs we have also with reproduction standards over the internet. In fact, what's very interesting is that the Guggenheim, for instance, has engaged, it's now, if I remember correctly, 8 years that they engage in a broad digitization process, especially of their art catalogs that have been completely digitized, and you can find them open access on the archive.org website. And you can glance through them really as if they were books. So art images, artworks become images. They are reproduced on art books. Art books themselves are reproduced again. So as you can see, and this is all over the last decade, so there was already the trial, the attempt to find standards and especially platforms that could provide an open access to these material, reevaluating even old materials like exhibition catalogs. If I remember correctly, the Guggenheim is in the process, for instance, of digitizing at least the first 100 catalogs, and it's an ongoing process. Even the Meta and the MoMA are doing this. But even the reproduction of the artwork is at stake here in the last 10 years, if not even more, because art images themselves have become commodities independently from the artwork. As you see here, a screenshot from Alami, which is one of the broadest and most known stock photo agencies, where the image is sold with of course a different fee according to the use that is being made, from personal use to business use. But what's interesting is that it isn't even the reproduction of the artwork being sold, but a picture that includes the artwork. This, for instance, as you can see, is a picture taken in 2012 at an exhibition at the Wallraf-Richartz Museum in Cologne. So again, still some time ago. But if you really like Mutter und Kind by Egon Schiele, you can just go on Amazon and download the file and print yourself a poster, or have someone send you the poster at home. So this is so much about art image circulation over the last decade. It's not just about museums having their role in harboring, preserving artworks, and also controlling, as we will see, the possibility of reproduction. In some way, the circulation of art images almost got out of hand. But what we will try to reconstruct is the different strategies that both art institutions, internet majors, and businesses like Alami have found to control, to constrain the possibility of reproduction of art images. In fact, what happened to the world of art images is, in a way, what happened to the music industry at the end of the 1990s. If you probably remember, I mean, several of you are my age, and so you probably remember Napster, which is one of the first services to provide the sharing of music files, and then Emule and whatever else. But probably the first industry that experienced the big impact of let's call them artwork circulation, was definitely the music industry. The art images and also the film industry came a little later. What's interesting that at the beginning, it's always like it was with Napster and Emule, as it seemed that these open access solutions would destroy an entire field. They would destroy the possibility of doing business, or at least to have sustainable solutions inside that very field. But that's not what happened. As you of course all know, with the music industry, they found a way to constrain the field again, to offer services, to offer high quality, and thus to segment the field into the different possibilities that one wants with reproduction of music. And the same almost happened in the last decade, so a little later, with art museums and the images of the artworks they harbor. This is, for instance, a very, I believe, a very interesting solution, almost the same one that also the Getty Museum and the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam or the National Gallery in London found. This is a screenshot from the Met, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and I chose again a work by Egon Schiele, a drawing of 1918, the very year he died. And it's interesting, as you can see, as you probably you've already been on the Met archive or on the Met web page. Most of the images they've put on are now in public domain, and there is a policy that can be read on how to use these pictures. Sometimes they can even be used for business purpose. So, and these solutions, providing free high-resolution images under Creative Commons, started around 2014. Those were the first. This was the output of the first big digitization processes in art museums around the world. So processes that actually started a little earlier, because in order to have images of artworks at disposal on your website, you already have had to digitize them, to put them in a database, to archive them, to metadata them, and then offer a solution on the internet that is publicly accessible, and which usually isn't the same database as is being used internally from museum professionals. And this is an important point. We'll see that with one of the references that I'll be talking of. So big museums started to offer free artwork images. They started also to hand out free art books, as we saw before with the Klimt Schiele catalog that you can see. It's in the middle of the upper row. Here, again, the archive.org. It started a little earlier, actually, with art books than with art images. Quite interestingly, the MoMA, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Getty Museum, they're all providing now digitized versions of many catalogs and art books they have produced. And so this definitely gives the opportunity, not just to scholars, but also to the wider public, to gain access to, well, I would say to a heritage, really, because especially for art historians, as we all are, it is often very, very difficult to lay hands on an old art catalog. Finding a version of it perfectly digitized is kind of the best thing that happens when you're working on something. But again, what happened over the last decade, is not that just major art museums started providing free art images or art books. There have been also wider projects of digitization based on a varied range of artworks, or even not really of artworks. One example that I find particularly interesting is the Watercolor World project, which is a UK-based charity that is collecting watercolors from around the world, actually starting with a few collections based in the United Kingdom. Watercolors that have were not intended as artworks for themselves, but documentary watercolors. So very often they are anonymous, or documenting simply everyday or special events. But since watercolors were used for documentary purposes, at least until the late 19th century, before photography took over, this is a very interesting project that tries to build a database, an open access database, that provides thousands and thousands of images. Most of them, this might seem a flaw of this project, are not provided with extremely well-built categories or metadata. But that's probably likely because the origin of much of these images is still questionable. So it kind of becomes a raw open archive where hopefully many scholars from around the world in searching through it, although the search keys are very generic still, could help find really some smaller or bigger treasures inside of this big collection of watercolors. So if this is what happened with art images and art collections, art museums over the last decade, and at a proceedingly swifter and swifter speed, one has really now to ask oneself if these developments are a gift to the world, if they are intended solely as a help for scholars, which in my opinion would be already enough, but maybe not. How and if they are a blow to copyright companies, and if they became an easy way for publishing houses to gain access to high quality images. Maybe these solutions have had all these aims in their minds. Some are very philanthropic, like the watercolors project, and while some others are in a kind, and this is the second question that one really needs to ask oneself, is if these developments, since we've heard of big names like the Guggenheim, the MoMA, the Met, the Getty, and so forth, if in a way this is also an attempt by world-leading institutions to keep up with a new field, the digital field, in which they want already to set the standard, which in a way also becomes mischievous as regards to cultural relevance and to political and economic power. It's not necessarily the most funded or most known institutions worldwide are. I mean, of course, they have probably the money to do this, but it is questionable whether they are also the culturally speaking the most important or the most relevant collections or artworks to be preserved digitally or to transferred on digital platforms. There are, of course, many other institutions, museums all over the world that simply lack digital access or funding, proper funding, to find their solutions and be present in this new field. So do these projects implicitly perpetuate an imperialist or capitalistic driven take on the art world? Well, probably yes, at least in part. So over the last decade, there are, with all these solutions and attempts and experimentation that has been done, there are definitely a few problems or flaws that have emerged, and which I believe are very relevant for scholars, not just for scholars, of course, also for museum professionals that work in this field, but they are interesting for us scholars because they show that the digitization process that has been in art institutions, or at least for artworks, mostly been driven by art museums and less by academia. But there's still space for debate, and there is very often also quite some space for scholars to help sort things out with art museums, and not just to them, but also especially to broader projects like I'm thinking of Wikipedia or the Google Arts and Culture project, where maybe there have been some flaws as regard to the content that comes with the art images. Three, I believe, are the big issues that that emerged over the last decade. The first one is that, as already mentioned, I hinted at it, the digitization of art images and of art books is very expensive. It is maybe a little less expensive now, but still someone has to carry the costs, especially because when we're talking of art museums, of big art collections, it is not in the hundreds, but it's in the thousands and 10,000s of items that need to be digitized. So the digital divide definitely exists, and it goes mainly with digital access and the huge cost of digitization. The second main issue, I believe, is one which isn't much different from the problems that the publishing industry had over the last 2 decades, which is the truthfulness of images, which, of course, for scholars, not just for scholars, is a special value. And there is a need of high standards of digitization and of reproduction. And this, again, pays on the costs, because digitization with advanced techniques is necessary. It is also very expensive. And the problem with the quality of art images is that, I mean, if you just pierce through Google looking for images, there is any possible quality of images of an artwork. And it's sometimes difficult to tell what is a good reproduction. It's not just high resolution that makes a good reproduction of an image. And so museums, especially art museums, have or had to, in the last decade, play a role in the truthfulness of images. The third issue at stake, I believe, is the problems that come with metadata. There is, of course, today, also through open projects like WikiArt, Wikipedia, and just like this, there are internet-based archives that offer easy access to art images. But the problem is comes very often with the criteria that are used within metadata. In my experience, I've worked for art museums, art collections, even for artist studios. The problem is always, or at least very often, that in a specific art institution, usually when building up a database, you try to find your way almost yourself, building up homemade criteria, or criteria that already were dependent on a physical archiving system that had been used maybe for decades, even for a century. And these are being transferred into the digital database, and then again transferred to an open access platform, if that is the case. And so often there is a lack of integration with categories or metadata with more broader taxonomies. And then there is the problem with internet-based archives, which provide easy access to art images and also some basic information. But sometimes, if you dig deeper into it, there are gross mistakes. And one example that I often like to point out is the Pinturas Negras by Francisco Goya, which, as you may know, is a wonderful cycle, the last big cycle of Francisco Goya. He painted them directly on the wall of the Quinta del Sordo outside Madrid. It was his retirement home. and today they are displayed at the Prado, Museo del Prado in Madrid. If you search for them almost everywhere on the internet, of course not on the website of the Prado, but on every other platform, you will read that this series of paintings, of works by Francisco Goya are frescoes, but actually they are not frescoes. They are a secco because they have been painted on a dry surface, not on a wet surface. It may seem of a detail of little relevance, but it is very relevant, especially not just to scholars, but even to the understanding of the creation of that particular series. So, so much about the three issues at stake over the last decade. Going on to the second part of this presentation, I would like to introduce shortly three contributions that I mean, I provided the link to the JSTOR stable link in order for you to read through these articles, which I find very interesting because they've been articles that have kind of recorded some paradigm shifts that happened over the last 10 years, and that in a way are forcing museums, art museums especially, to rethink themselves. The first one is this contribution that revolves around the Tropenmuseum in the Netherlands. And the problem here starts again with the creation of databases. In fact, during the late 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century, the biggest effort of art institutions and museums was to build their own digital database in which to transfer the records and all the categories and metadata system they had employed physically during the 20th century. So rather than already providing a publicly open database, the first decade of the 21st century was really one in which art museums tried to find their way with or find their own solution in databases. And this is very much what the authors of Network Knowledge and Epistemic Authority and Development of Virtual Museums point out, that almost everything that has happened over the last decade, so which was the decade in which museums tried then to build open platforms to engage with with new audiences. Well, actually, this was usually based on databases of the collection, of the respective collections that had been digitized over the previous decade, so the first decade of the 21st century. And the peculiarity there is that those databases onto which then the publicly displayed collection is being based, those databases actually have been created, planned, shaped around the needs of internal museum professionals. So for their internal workflow, not in the light of user orientation. So this is a step that came afterwards, and that is also a big problem, because whenever you start then to build a platform or an open archive for the general audience, not necessarily for scholars, because many of them, I mean, of course, we had already access to internal databases when available already before they were publicly displayed over the internet. Well, that is the problem, is that usually searching on those kind of databases is possible or easy only for someone who is already interacting with that kind of visual material, with those keywords, with those categories, with those metadata. So you need some a priori knowledge that the general public doesn't have. So when new interfaces are shaped for the general public, it becomes very important, basically, to have an entirely new project. That's, for instance, what museums like the Rijksmuseum or the Met tried. So not simply to transfer their internal databases onto the internet, but really use it as a source, but reinvent the online interface on a user-oriented path. The second paradigm shift, which emerged particularly thanks to the digitization process of the last decade, is a shift in the way we understand museum objects, which very much has to do with the history of museums themselves over the last two centuries. In diverse knowledge and contact zones within the digital museums, the authors argued that there are two kinds of definitions. On one side, the museum object as a specimen, and on the other side, the museum object as embedded. And the first one, of course, refers to the very idea with which museums emerged in the late 18th and early 19th century. So they held the specimens. They were considered an item that represented a larger body of knowledge, like a witness of a broader culture, usually a culture that is either chronologically or geographically very distant, according whether it is, I don't know, a medieval arts museum or a ethnographic museum. But what digitization particularly brought into awareness was that the museum object, especially today, thanks to digital platforms, needs to be understood as an embedded object. That means it is an active object, an object that acts within a larger dynamic cultural and discursive system. It is interconnected with an audience, with a particular reference community. And even if it's artworks of the past, still the museum needs to build a reference to contemporary times and to the contemporary audience that engages with it. So, shifting to a metaphor, the authors argue, into which objects are not anymore just vessels of an objective knowledge, particularly if such a thing as objective knowledge exists, but they're trying to transfer us towards museum objects that have a biography. They have a history that is sometimes even mutually written by reference communities. The last interesting contribution, even though it's of 2013 by Enrico Bertacchini and Federico Morando, is actually a paper that is not being written by digital or public humanists, but by business specialists. And what's interesting about it is that these business administration scholars looked at what was happening in the field of art image circulations with regard to the organizational strategy. So how images are being managed on digital platforms. And this chart is, I believe, very useful because as business scholars usually do, they try to sum up everything into charts, which may sometimes oversimplify it, but often it is very useful to visibly understand what difference lies between the solutions. And they noticed 4 principal strategies or models that have been employed by different categories of players in the art field over the last decades. And so what is important, I believe, in the interpretation of these authors is that somehow the perspective, it's not important to take the particular perspective of a kind of institution whether it is a business institution, an art institution, a state museum, a private museum, a stock photo agency, or whatever. So it's not important. The nature of the organization is not that important, but they're rather pointing at the managerial solution they have found. So that is what really drives the strategy. And the four strategies they display, as you can see, are basically, so the first one, which is online access and display, and they then also tried in this chart to categorize what type of control the mother institution of these images, of these art images, have on the art images themselves, which is pretty much the problem with digital circulation of art images. So what kind of control do I have as a museum or as an artist or as a charity or as a stock photo agency over images? So solutions had to be found the same way as solutions have been found in the music industry. Online access and display, well, that's something, of course, that museums, as we can see, as we've seen with the Met example, have tried to implement over the last 10 years. It is, of course, kind of a indirect value appropriation strategy, because no one's really gaining anything from it, at least not financially or economically. But it is important for spreading the collection on the new platform, on the online platform. But of course, what is important with this is that the accessibility, the quality of images, and the content is authoritative. It is trusted. So it costs a lot, art museums, to do this. But in order to keep at least, I would call it an authoritative control over their artworks, it is important that they become the sole reference point with regard to trusted content and quality, image quality of their artworks, in order for visitors or scholars to relate to these institutions directly and not to some other kind of image provider over the internet. Then the second model is, of course, proprietary licensing, which is something that still museums are trying to use. They're trying to exploit some kind of business models in order to gain some revenues from the circulation of their images, and usually they need the assistance of commercial stock photo agencies, like Alami. You've seen also some others, but essentially, and this can be seen when looking at the budgets of art museums, the revenues, the direct revenues from this kind of model are very, very, very low. As scholars, you probably all know that it is us they're asking money from when we need to print an art image, the image of an artwork, in our books or papers, even if they are scholarly papers and academic books, which don't have a broad circulation. Open licensing as the fourth solution that has been employed over the last decade, which again is quite indirect, and but speaks to a much broader web users audience. And this is something, for instance, that the Germans know the Bundesarchive have done with Wikimedia or the Commons project. So especially big state archives that basically entered in partnership with internet providers in order to give authoritative and trusted content, reduce transaction costs, and have the possibility to spread their materials And to have specialty solutions, I mean search engines and databases, but database structures that are not in-house. They're not in-house, so that this of course takes a big cost away, but they are then more easily accessible. And then of course there's the fourth model, which is the user-generated use of images. So like with Wikipedia Loves Art or Smart History, where web users have been allowed to use these images. Coming to the end, to the third part and to the final part of my seminar, my presentation. So far, I've kind of addressed what the big issues were or still are in the field of digitization, public practices for art images and art museums. Then I've tried to give you these three scholarly takes on who described and analyzed, I believe, very well what kind of paradigm shifts or organizational models have emerged as standards during the last decade. And so I would like now to draw the attention to a very specific study case, which are art institutions, contemporary art institutions, particularly in Venice, the city where we should all have been now, but hopefully we will all meet together very soon. Why is the case of Venice important? I believe it is particularly important when we simply take a look at the city map of Venice. And this is a very particular city map. This is the one of the Venice Biennale last year, 2019, the Art Biennale. As you probably know, the Biennale has biennial ongoing events every 2 years. The art exhibition last year was the art exhibition. It won't be next year, but in 2022. But anyway, what this map shows you is the height of the development and spread inside the ancient city of the art exhibitions during the Venice Biennale. So as you see, the two bigger areas, the light blue one, the Arsenale, and the yellow one, the Giardini, are the two main venues of the Venice Biennale. So are the historically and institutional venues of the Venice Biennale. Everything else, where you see these smaller squares and rectangles, these are either collateral events or other participating countries that don't have space inside the main venue. And when we speak of the main venues, we're already speaking of something that, if I remember correctly, is about 25,000 square meters. So really a huge exhibition space. But these are all other exhibitions related to the Venice Biennale. They're all official events during the Venice Biennale that spread through the city. So you can see that this is, it has a big impact. These are the visitor figures over the last decade. If we would draw them back to 2001, visitors actually started in 2001 with around 150,000 visitors per exhibition. And in 2017, it topped 600,000 visitors and almost 700,000 last year. So big figures for contemporary art exhibitions, not such big figures actually for Venice itself as a main tourist hotspot. It has between 25 millions and 30 million visitors per year. So as you can see, the Venice Biennale itself doesn't impact that much, but it is a high figure for the specialized field of contemporary art. And this instead is the growth of national pavilions and collateral events at the Venice Biennale. Actually, as you can see, the collateral events somehow decreased in the last few years. This is not due to a lack of interest in the art exhibition, which still is, together with Documenta, the hotspot of the art world. But rather, it depends on the fact that the Venice Biennale charges external exhibitions, collateral events to be part of the Biennale. So, and it's not a small sum. But there is much more beyond the Venice Biennale. Over the last 20 years, a set of new, highly reputed art institution emerged in Venice. Of course, Capesaro is as almost as old as the Venice Biennale. It is the modern art museum of Venice. It's a state museum. It's actually run by the city mayor. But then some newer ones like the Fondazione Prada, the Punta della Dogana Palazzo Grassi, which is the Fondation Pinault, the private collection of the great French collector François Pinault, and also proprietor of Christie's auction house. Then we have the Peggy Guggenheim collection, the once collection of private collection of Peggy Guggenheim that became part of the Guggenheim museums and opened in the 1980s. And then the Fondazione Emilia La Biancavedova, the private foundation of the one-time painter Emilio Vedova, one of the most relevant Italian artists of after the Second World War. So a lot of institutions emerged over the last 20 years, and they are even too many for a city like Venice, which has only now, unfortunately, in the city center, just a little more than 50,000 inhabitants. If we add up all the other islands and the university students, we don't top the 70,000 inhabitants in the city center. And you can see that the figure of 25, 30 million visitors per year is really kind of squeezing the inhabitants out of the city. So it is for sure that these art institutions are not speaking to the residents of Venice, but they exist in Venice because of the historic relevance of the Venetian art scene and of the city, and they attract a global audience. The fact is indeed that we have three majors, worldwide majors, for budget, for reputation, for audience in Venice. The Venice Biennale, the oldest one, founded in 1895, the Peggy Guggenheim collection, as I said, founded in 1980, and then the youngest born, the Fondation François Pinault, which opened in 2006 and then enlarged to Punta della Dogana in 2009. So three major players in a small city, which basically need to attract a worldwide audience to Venice and contend this audience. So the way I try to analyze what they have been doing over the last 15 years, actually, with regard to digitization practices and public participation, was trying to put it in a chart and see how much have a double binary system, see how much these three institutions went into participatory practices or authoritative practices, how much they did on site and how much they did online. Because what is important about all the development we've described so far over these last decades is that there isn't one and only solution, whether a museum wants to be authoritative or participatory. There are a set of different solutions that span between these coordinates. For instance, here are very quick several other scholarly references which talk about the importance of taking a visitor-centered approach when developing digital museum resources. We've had these already, and to see also that what was at the beginning the center of digitization practices was simply an evolutionary extension of museums activity into the digital realm, while in the last 10 years, with the appearance of virtual museums, the virtual museums or platforms that provide virtual access to museum collections open up a completely and entirely different field that museums and collections have to engage with. With regard to the participatory and the authoritative, well, it is important to see that inside museums there is this kind of struggle between still keeping the privilege of the account of the expert, while online technology would kind of tend to distribute social practice and allow broader audiences to engage, even contradictory with contradictory perspectives in the contents, in the content building of museums. So this is to say that when going online for museums, the challenge is not just being still the kind of authoritative institutions they have always been on site, in presence, but they really have to try and engage with the audiences in a way and give them room to be engaged and to contribute, to empower the public. Just very briefly, what happened at the Venice Biennale, which had quite a stable period over the last 15 years, as they had one president, Paolo Baratta, who stayed for the last 12 years. So as a state-run institution, although it is an almost private foundation, they had time to provide solutions, quite stable solutions. They've worked very much into the educational programs, which of course was kind of a fashion wave all around the world in museums for different age cohorts. Then they have something at the Biennale which is kind of the big treasure that needs to be dug out, which is the ASAC, the Archivio Storico delle Arti Contemporanee. It is the immense archive of the Venice Biennale, founded in 1973, then reformed several times. They have opened a presence library in 2009, but unfortunately the archives itself stayed outside of the Venice city center, mainly for preservation reasons. But it is, I would say, utterly inaccessible to maybe to scholars, not so much, but definitely to the general public. While it really is not just a documentary archive, but really a treasure of contents in the entire range of artistic disciplines of the 20th century. If you consider that the Biennale was the first arts institution working in visual arts, theater, cinema, dance, music, and architecture. So this is something that they haven't built up so far. Well, of course, there is a kind of search engine to run through the archive, but almost nothing has been digitized so far, and it is extremely difficult to access. But luckily, the new recently nominated president of the Venice Biennale, Roberto Cicuto, who comes from the film industry, understands the wealth they're harboring inside the Biennale archive, and he's already planning a digitized and public development for this immense treasure. Rather, over the last 15 years, the Biennale has engaged online with the so-called Biennale channel, which basically was a kind of a TV channel, a video content channel, active particularly during the main events. The Peggy Guggenheim collection, which has the advantage of having a stable collection, has worked. This is actually now the old version of the website. They just recently renewed it in April during the lockdown. But it was already over the last 10 years a pretty good online archive where you could really. I mean, it wasn't so much user-oriented with regard to a virtual visit, but it was definitely very well structured, especially to the authoritative contents of the collection. They have engaged also in many educational programs, which some of them are really extremely leading programs for contemporary art and Europe-wide. And just recently, they've also developed a Guggenheim virtual tour. Since the museum isn't immense, isn't that huge in size, they managed to have a sort of virtual tour like the Google Street View, but with one limit, that you cannot run through the rooms. You always have to choose the room from the map. And that's something extremely interesting, I believe, because we're talking of digitization, but it is important also to have in presence public programs. They did something very important, like the Guggenheim Tactile program. So the reproduction of some of the most known artworks of the collection, like Les Bagneuse of Pablo Picasso, for people who cannot access these artworks visibly. The very last institution I'm talking of is the Palazzo Grassi in Punta della Logana, so the Fondation François Pinault, which kind of has the problem that, I mean, they are based on one of the widest contemporary art collections in the world, the one of François Pinault, but they don't have a stable collection there. They have changing exhibitions every year. So they kind of have the same problem as the Venice Biennale. So not having a stable exhibition, a stable collection, you basically have to reinvent yourself also digitally and with the public programs at every new event, which of course is very costly and time consuming. So what Palazzo Grassi worked on, besides the usual education programs, is a quite interesting participatory program with teenagers from all around Italy who had been invited to visit the exhibitions, where actually they were allowed to program their own wiki with all the artists, themes, and artworks that had been on display at Palazzo Grassi, especially this one at Palazzo Grassi. So, in order to give them really a chance to write text about them, to create the contents. So, really, a very open and participatory program. So, where do the three Venetian majors stand? At least according to the last 15 years, the Biennale is rather positioned well halfway between on-site and online, but particularly still retains its role as an authoritative institution. The Guggenheim has tried to be a little more participatory, especially opening up to diverse audiences. While maybe Punta della Dogana has been the one who has tried to be more inventive with regard to online developments, probably also because of the three majors, it is the one that has less visitors on site, and so it tried to enhance its presence on an online platform. So, having looked at these three examples, are we really confronting us with truly new approaches? Well, maybe not so much, but what is important is, I believe, that we need to move away from a binary opposition between the real objects, the real artworks, the real art images inside the museum physically present, and their digital representation. It is not digital representation is not reproduction anymore only of the artwork, but they exist contemporarily, and they offer alternative reciprocal model of engaging with things. So one has to develop plans in parallel between the two, not in opposition, and not as an extension, but in parallel, I believe. Understand also whether users are becoming more engaged by digital tools. This would be also very important. At least these three cases have tried to involve the audience, but very often it is based on educational programs that don't really hand a lot of power. They are not really empowering to the general public. They're not really handing over the keys of the museums, but still are stuck in a kind of an authoritative classroom model. So, by way of a conclusion, the problem, I believe, especially with contemporary art, as spoken in general of art museums, but these three cases all lie in contemporary art, is that contemporary art itself is a constantly contested territory. It is very often told to be exclusive, especially in its legitimacy and validation, seemingly arcane. But on the other side, the definition of art over the last 50, 60 years has become so inclusive that it is almost impossible to define an artwork anymore. What can be seen at the example of these three Venetian majors is actually, I believe, that we've spoken a lot of paradigm shifts, of general models. Well, when you enter then specific institutions, what makes the difference is usually the institutional framework. So who's in charge? Whether there is stability, whether there is a draw towards change. And the other thing that is very important is the organizational approach that that specific institution is employing, whether it is trying to solve things as if they were simply internal tasks and thus finding homemade solutions, or if they are engaging with external providers and thus really open up the organization to cooperation. What probably hasn't changed is we're not quite at what Jacques Rancière means for an emancipated spectator. So the possibility really of a paradigm shift, not just in what museum objects are or what the digital realm is and public realm is for museums, but what kind of audience do we really have? What kind of audience do we want for art museums? And what kind of space and authority and power do we want to hand over to audience? That's probably the biggest paradigm shift in museums and especially museum professionals and even we art scholars have to do. Opening up to the digital and to the public means also being not afraid of empowering the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diego, for this engaging talk on the digitization practices. Now for questions, you can either write your question in the chat or just write in the chat question, and I'll give you the word and the turn to speak. I would like to start actually with a general question about, okay. I take advantage bluntly of my position of where are we going with digitization COVID present time, like and
well, I think
what do you see that we are going?
So I believe where we are going now is probably at least I'm speaking of Europe, is that what emerges is the necessity of covering the new digital realm, which is and will become even more the principal access of audiences to a museum, an art museum collection. Of course, I believe and I love going into art museums, but it is probably not sustainable anymore that all the world comes to Venice or to other art cities and museums. So it is. I hope that the digital development will first of all open up the true engagement of art museums with new audiences, and it will be necessary to strategically plan and thoroughly structure the digital presence of museums. What is happening, at least in Europe, I can see, is that, of course, as you've seen over the last decade, major art institutions, Rijksmuseum, Met, MoMA, and so on, they already invested huge amounts of money to set the standards in the field. What is happening now is that European institutions, or I think, for instance, the Minister of Culture in Italy, Dario Franceschini, just recently in an interview said is that there need to be many more funds in digitization for cultural institutions. If we will really have more funds to digitize art collections, this is a wonderful thing, because that's been the first big divide between the smaller enterprises and the majors. But this, of course, will also heighten the need for professionals that understand how to digitize and how to make sense of it. Because the problem is, you can digitize whatever you want, but you may have to make sense of it, and you really have to able new audiences to engage with the art collections.
Thank you. Cristina Moraru has a question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned in the first part of your presentation about this problematic of image quality in the age of image circulation. And I wanted to bring into discussion an article published in Influx by Hito Steyer in defense of the poor image. Well, Hito Steyer believed that in the contemporary world, this dynamism of image circulation hindered the quality of the image in favor of its accessibility. Therefore, the image of an artwork is nothing more than a reminder of its former visual self. So it cannot be considered an object of contemplation, but rather an image that it does not have enough materiality. So I wanted to ask you if you think we can identify, as Hito Steyer does, if we can identify a hierarchy of images, or even more in Marxist terms, if we can observe class differences between images, where the poor image is either a blurred image or with low resolution or out of focus, can be considered inferior to a rich image with a higher resolution. This is the argument that she makes in this article.
Yes, I know very well. I know very well her contribution, and it is an interesting stance that you mentioned, because Hito Steyer, I mean, having worked for Douglas Gordon, who is a video artist who works on very often on the poor quality of images, for instance, of found materials. I believe there is an aesthetic value in low resolution that is very valuable. But the fact is, unfortunately, that as I've tried to describe, is that business models, unfortunately, or luckily or unfortunately, they develop for themselves even market solution, even without us controlling them very often. This is something that has happened. This is why I made the parallel with the music industry, because this is really something that started over there. There will always be business enterprises that will try to draw money out of it, and with digital search tools, they are also incredibly effective in controlling who is using images without copyright. So we're definitely entering a realm. I wouldn't say a police control system, but in some way, yes. So I understand that Hito Steyer's remark is really one of resistance against the complete capitalization of image circulation. I believe that there is some good news with regard to this. So the fact that big museum institutions are providing Creative Commons licenses for their images, even in quite good high resolution, means that at least in, at least with museum professionals, still lie the urgency to go public with their artworks, not to have them exploited as commodities. Whether that is enough, I don't know, because we all know as scholars, every time, as I already mentioned, we need to write a paper and we would like to include a particular picture because it is important to have that picture. Any museum will make us pay for it. That's usually what comes. So there is a hierarchy. The thing is, it depends also on the needs of the particular audience, because some are simply satisfied also with lower definition results, and usually the market solutions try to exploit the ones who want higher services. So that's kind of, in these big markets where broad circulation over the internet is almost unstoppable. The market trend is charging you for higher services. So yes, I believe Hitlersteyer's stance is really one of resistance towards this kind of commodification of art images themselves, which is rather strange, because it's really squeezing money out of something that isn't the thing itself, because, as you mentioned, the artwork lies in the museum, and this is some kind of it's shadow, like in Plato's cave, that is going along. So we're really talking of shadows, not of the objects themselves.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Well, I would also like to take advantage of my position, and I would like to link this seminar with the one we are going to have on Wednesday. And that's why I would like to know a little bit better, which is your opinion about the role of user-generated contents in these projects of renovation of traditional institutions, and how the interaction with the users can be part of these new projects that you were mentioning before.
Well, as you may know, we're lucky enough to have Irma Hermans speaking on Wednesday and then on Thursday, if I'm correct, Barbara. So she comes from the Rijksmuseum, and the Rijksmuseum is probably the one who is, I believe, setting the best standard in with regard to user-generated content and to the availability for audiences to use, or even to use their artworks creatively. That is for sure one field of extreme development that still has to be explored. Many art institutions resist this kind of employment, which is rather strange. I remember, I mean, having worked for several artists, it's funny that I mean, in common artistic practice, I'm speaking not of museums but of really of artists, copying from another artist, borrowing from another artist, stealing from another artist, doing collages, mashups. If we think of that, of Cubism, is really part of the creative process itself. While with all these copyright agencies that are emerging now, and a lot of contemporary artists like Lascaux himself, or Damon Hirst, Jeff Koons, are all protecting their artworks, and especially the reproduction of their images, especially towards user-generated content, which is strange, because they themselves rely as artists on copying, on borrowing, on stealing. So I believe that art institutions that are simply more realistic or clever, like the Rijksmuseum, are engaging on the right path of allowing their art images to be reused, to be transformed. And there is, as you know, Carolina, also an entire field of transformative use copyrights, which is emerging. So it is an upwards trend, but with regard to contemporary art creations, it is rather strange that artists themselves are kind of blocking the accessibility to their artworks. And they're rather trying to squeeze money out of who wants to reuse their images, very much in the way that the music industry does. But again, it's strange because for visual artists, it is a common practice to do mashups, to do collages. So it will be hard to convince high-ranking artists to give access to their images. Of course, we mentioned Hito Steidl, who instead is giving access to images. It is a contested territory, especially with contemporary art, and especially because contemporary art, being younger than 75 years, allows copyright laws, depending on the country, to be very, very strict.
Thank you, Diego. Yeah, I really agree that it's a pity that we don't have these situations in which we can play with this remix culture in this context. And also it's a very important way to engage the young public. If we want to build this bridge and make young people go to the museums, to the traditional institutions, this is something that have a very important place, in my opinion. We will have more time to discuss it. And thank you so much for such an inspiring seminar. Really,
thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Otherwise, I see a lot of thank you, Diego, in the chat.
Okay, thank you. No, I hope really I didn't annoy you too much with the long talk, but I hope I shifted from theory to developments and to a case study in order to show what's really happening, and that's funny also, despite whatever we scholars do. I mean, very often we're just set at describing, analyzing what's happening out there, as if we were looking at some birds in a cage. And we are the outside observer, but we are also, and I think that's important for scholars to engage themselves with art institutions, especially when it comes to digitization and public practices, because I hope what came out of this, especially of the last case study, is that very often art institutions don't rely on scholars. Not that we know everything, we probably don't know a thing, but we know at least a little. And we can really help them out, making the difference, especially with regard to questions of open source, of audience engagement, of user-generated content, and so on. So there is room to help art institutions escape business models that go towards commodification, as Hito Steidl would put it. And yeah, so we are kind of the resistance, like in Star Wars. I don't know. But that's something that scholars, I believe, really should do. So try to help art institutions and museums to open up their eyes and not be wanting only revenues and gains and whatever. I don't think any art institution will ever gain much money out of the circulation of art images. That is for stock photo agencies to do, but not for art institutions. They shouldn't even attempt to do it. And this is something that we as scholars, art historians, can help them do.
Thank you very much, Diego.
Very well.
If there aren't any more questions, I thank again Diego for his wonderful talk. And I hope I will see you all tomorrow morning. At the same link from tomorrow morning, the open lessons are at this link. Sorry if there was any confusion. I read some emails, but I do hope you all managed to enter, to knock on the door of the virtual room and let everybody in. And tomorrow morning you will, well, I am a bit embarrassed because I am the speaker tomorrow morning. So yes.
I will present you, so don't be embarrassed at all. Absolutely.
So please have a great rest of the afternoon and see you all tomorrow, hopefully. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, see you all tomorrow for the next seminar of Barbara Tramelli. I also hope you enjoyed it, and come back for some more tomorrow and over the next few days of this week.
Thank you.
Goodbye to everyone. Grazie Carolina, grazie Barbara.
Grazie a te, Diego.
Bye to everyone. Thank you.
Complimenti, Diego.
Ah sì, dai, vi è piaciuto? Bene.
Smetto la registrazione, interrompo la registrazione.
Sì, interrompi.